So we talked about yesterday about what membership 2.0 and what rejoining the European Union for the UK, or maybe even England, as we might be at that point, might actually entail, what it would mean to do, and the functions we would have to go through. But I came across this blog. It's called John Danzig's World, and to be honest, he's got some pretty good arguments here. And it's basically called Breturn versus Brexit. And here he lists out the arguments for not only the argument against Brexit, which we know, but there's some that again are worth going over and constantly worth going over, because very often Brexiteers don't have any counter arguments other than just shouting a slogan at people. We've got also arguments for actually returning as well, which I think are something we should look at as a channel who is very pro-EU. I think these are arguments that we should look at and should definitely start discussing and start getting out there, because sooner or later we are going to actually have to reverse this, quite frankly, awful democratic position that we put ourselves into and rejoin the European Union. So, first of all, thank you to John Danzig's World. I will try and remember to leave a link, although I know I'm awful at doing that. But do go check out his blog. He's written some other pretty good blogs as well. So, Breturn versus Brexit. Brexit is based on blatant mistruths and lies. You may not believe this now, but you will all believe it next year when Brexit finally arrives, cold, clammy, and callous, and naked and exposed. Every reason given to leave was a shrinking falsification. When one day there is a public inquiry into how our country was conned, there will be gaps into how conniving, cunning, and politicians managed to get away with it. Lies, lies, and more lies. That's how Leave won. In summary, first point, more sovereignty. Nonsense. We'll get less. In the EU, we gained a share of sovereignty of our continent. Outside the EU, we still live on a planet and have to obey thousands of international laws and treaties. We share sovereignty with NATO, for example. Is there a reason to leave it? Next point, fewer migrants. Really, just think about it. Most EU migrants in Britain have been in gainful employment, doing jobs that we simply don't have enough Britons to do, and making a massive net contribution to our treasury and economy. Migrants come here for jobs, and if there are no jobs, then mostly don't come or don't stay. Next point, more houses, schools, and hospitals. Think again. Britain has a chronic shortage of skilled workers. Without EU migrants, there will be fewer builders, teachers, doctors, and nurses. Migrants are not the cause of our problems. Blaming them just excuses successive UK governments from investing sufficiently in our country. Next point, get our country back. We never lost it. If being in the EU means losing your country, why aren't there 27 other EU member states planning to leave? And none of them are, really, there are actually none of them. Support for the EU is its highest it's ever been in 35 years. Next point, our own laws. The vast majority of our laws in the UK are our laws and are passed by our Parliament in Westminster. Otherwise, it would have nothing to do. But in the EU, we benefit from laws and regulations for our continent that no single country alone could ever actually achieve. Could our UK government have got mobile phone companies to scrap exorbitant roaming charges across the entire EU? To take Google to task for abusive practices? To ensure generous compensation for delayed flights across our continent? Of course not. It took the might of 28 EU countries working together to achieve that, and so much more. Next point. The EU is run by faceless bureaucrats. Another lie. The EU is a democracy, run and ruled by its members, the 27 countries of the EU, along with its democratically elected European Parliament. The European Commission is the servant of the EU, not its master. And the European Parliament has the power to choose and dismiss the entire Commission. So now we'll get on to the case for Breturn. So before Brexit, no member state had ever left the EU, and no other member state is planning to leave now. That's hardly surprising. All the reasons to be an EU member are based on true, tangible and tested benefits over many decades. So let's start with the first one. It's more profitable to be a member. EU membership is profitable. In real terms, it cost Britain nothing to belong to the EU. On the contrary, we get back many times the cost of annual membership fee. Being in the EU made us better off. The CIB has calculated that EU membership was worth around £3,000 a year to every British family, a return of nearly £10 for every £1 we paid in. Peace. It's the structure of the EU that has been helped to ensure that no shots have ever been fired between member states. That's an enormous achievement for a continent that was previously used to violence, wars and subjugation as a way to settle issues. In 2012, by unanimous decision of the Norwegian Nobel Committee, the EU won the Nobel Peace Prize for advancing the causes of peace, democracy and human rights in Europe for over 60 years. Freedoms. The EU gives member states freedom across much of our continent. EU citizens enjoy the right to live, work, study or retire in any EU or EEA country, including access to state healthcare, education and when working in those countries. It's a precious right that took decades to achieve. The EU also gives members the right to free and frictionless trade between member states, which has helped maintain Europe as one of the planet's richest continents. The loss of these freedoms will be increasingly devastating for Britain and Britons themselves. Almost half of all our exports are just over half of our imports go to and come from the EU. Nowhere else in the world even comes close. The EU has an iron tariff wall against non-members. Outside the EU, we are on the wrong side of that wall. Non-European countries that have negotiated free trade agreements with the EU don't enjoy full free trade access to Europeans' internal market, as Britain did as an EU member. Democracy. EU members have a democratic say, votes and vetoes on the running of the future direction of our continent. Outside the EU, Britain can only look on as those decisions are made without us, even though those decisions will affect us just as much whether we're in the EU or not. Leaving it means losing sovereignty, not gaining it. Power. The EU is the world's largest and most successful trading bloc, the world's biggest exporter and importer of manufactured goods and services. The EU is one of the world's top 3 economies, alongside the USA and China. The euro, in record time, has become the world's most traded and trusted currency, alongside the US dollar. All that gives the EU huge power, reach and muscle, enabling it to negotiate the best free trade agreements with other countries on behalf of its members. Outside the EU, Britain is unlikely to get free trade deals as good as, let alone better than, the free trade agreements we had as an EU member, covering over 70 countries. In any event, it will take years, maybe decades, to actually find out. Protection. EU laws protecting the rights of workers, consumers and travellers across our continent are probably among the most important EU member benefits. For example, 4 weeks paid holiday a year, the 48-hour working week, the anti-discrimination law, guaranteed rights for agency workers, guaranteed worker constitutionals. All these protections largely exist because of the EU. No single national government can assure safety and protection across our continent. It needs the reach of a pan-European intergovernmental organisation to achieve that. Britain enjoys cleaner beaches as a direct result from EU directives on protecting the environment. Before those directives, successive British governments were not interested in clearing up our beaches. In addition, the EU is leading the world in tackling climate change, something that individual countries alone simply can't undertake. The government's post-Brexit plan is to take away the rights of British citizens to sue them over issues such as workers' rights, environmental policies, and business regulation. These rights to sue our government on these issues is something we only enjoyed under EU law. And we may lose other rights as a direct result of Brexit. Strength. In a world dominated by the US, China, and Russia, Britain is dwarfed on its own. Being part of the EU gives us a bigger say and more strength on the global stage than as a small country out at sea going it alone. We could instead become a closer ally to the USA. But is that really what we want? When Brexit arrives for real on the 1st of January 2021 onwards, we will be poorer with less sovereignty, fewer rights, protections, restricted trade, and diminished power. The case for Breturn, Britain returning to the EU as a full member, is simply overwhelming. It may take years for a democratic reversal of Brexit, but it's a worthwhile fight. In a democracy, losing doesn't mean having to give up. Ask Brexiteers, they know. We can win next time, we just have to ensure we get a next time. And I completely agree with everything that was said there. Those arguments are just massively compelling, and there's no, there's no real comeback to that. I'm sorry, but there's no comeback because all these Brexiteer promises about Brexit just aren't going to be fulfilled. The problems that many Brexiteers complain about were never, ever the fault of the EU. They were the problems of our own government, specifically the very government that is now in control. And as I've said, next year, that's when the true Tory agenda will come online. And I'm perfectly sure we will see another, shall we say, manifesto type published from the government about what it plans to do. And mainly, those will be to strip as many rights and regulations that we so took for granted as being a member of the EU. And to be honest, the only way we have even a chance of regaining all that we lost is, as been said there, is to return. And quite frankly, that is what we have to be aiming for. But as was said very clearly now, all we have to do is wait. Brexit dies on the 1st of January 2021.